H.L.V. Desrosiers is widely looked upon as the first Indian poet in English. Among the important poets of the pre-independence period are Tharu Dutt, Sarojini Naidu, Sri Aurobindo, Swami Vivekananda, and Joseph Furtado. A tectonic shift took place in Indian poetry in English around 1947, around independence. The important poets of the early post-independence period include Nizim Ezekiel, Kamala Das, Dom Moraes, A.K. Ramanujan, R. Parthasarathi, and Keki Daruwala. If Sarojini Naidu is the most important woman poet of the pre-independence period, Kamala Das is the most important woman poet of the post-independence period. If H.L.V. Desrosiers is the first Indian poet in English, Nizim Ezekiel is generally regarded as the first modern Indian poet in English. The publication of Nizim Ezekiel's first book of poems, aptly titled A Time to Change, by Fortune Press, London, in 1952, was responsible for inaugurating a new era in Indian poetry in English. Post-independence Indian poetry in English is dramatically different from its pre-independence counterpart. Let us scrutinize the important differences between the two. The pre-independence poets were highly conventional in their approach. They mastered the rules of English prosody and tried their best to apply the rules as blindly as possible. They deliberately imitated the British poets and never attempted to carry out any innovation in the work that they did. In contrast to this, the post-independence poetry is highly experimental. The poets, the early post-independence poets decided that the time had come to break all conventions. The message conveyed by the title of the first book of poems of Nizim Ezekiel, which is also a very important book in the history of Indian poetry in English, is extremely significant. The title of Ezekiel's book is A Time to Change. The time had indeed come to change, and the first important change experienced by Indian poetry in English was the passionately experimental approach of the new poets. Practically the whole of pre-independence Indian poetry in English is in traditional verse. Traditional verse has three crucial aspects: the meter line, the stanzaic pattern, and the regular rhyme scheme. The pre-independence poets meticulously ensured that these three crucial aspects of traditional verse were present in their poetry. In contrast to this, the bulk of post-independence Indian poetry in English is in verse libre or free verse. In fact, only very few post-independence Indian poets in English are capable of producing traditional verse And these poets include Nizim Ezekiel, Domorais, and Keki Daruwala. Free verse, as its very name suggests, differs from traditional verse in the sense that it does not make use of, it has abandoned the metered line, the stanzaic pattern, and the regular rhyme scheme. Free verse uses lines of varying length, and the manipulation of linear length is one of the crucial aspects of free verse. It is true that free verse has given up the important features of traditional verse, but it is also true that free verse sometimes makes use of these features for special effects. For example, though a free verse poem may not have a regular rhyme scheme, the poem may occasionally make use of rhyme to generate a special effect. Similarly, though free verse does not accept stanzaic patterns, practically all long free verse poems are divided into verse paragraphs which resemble closely the stanzas of traditional verse. Above all, though free verse has abandoned the metered line, occasionally the ghost of a meter can be found to linger in some free verse line, and at times the poet may make use of meter for generating a special effect. The pre-independence poetry is notorious for its taboos and totems. It was very Victorian in its approach. There were numerous areas, thematic areas, which were forbidden territory for Indian poetry in English before independence. These areas include bodily functions, sex, in general anything which is unacceptable, in general anything which is unacceptable to Victorian morality. In sharp contrast to this, there are no taboos and totems in the post-independence poetry. There are no holy cows, to put it in another way. The post-independence poetry freely discusses sex, freely discusses all those areas which are taboos to its pre-independence counterpart. An important result of this contrast is that the pre-independence poetry had a very limited thematic range. The pre-independence poets refused to talk about many aspects of life. In fact, they even refused to talk about anything which was just ordinary. Anything which was ordinary was left untouched by the pre-independence poetry. After independence, Indian poetry in English experienced a dramatic expansion of thematic possibilities. Of course, Nizim Ezekiel, the first modern Indian poet in English, played a key role in this sudden expansion of thematic possibilities. Overnight, no subject was taboo, and overnight, all the totems were smashed. The post-independence poetry freely and frankly discusses sex. In fact, sometimes one feels that it is even obsessed with sex. It freely and frankly discusses the bodily functions. Above all, it writes extensively and honestly about ordinary life. The India that we come across in pre-independence Indian poetry in English has very little in common with the real India of the day. What we meet with is an idealistic version of India. What we meet with is a romanticized version of India. One cannot find fault with the poets. India was at that time a subject nation, and some of the poets were freedom fighters as well. Most of the poets were passionate patriots. I would like to remind you of the fact that the most famous poem of H.L.V. Derozio is To India, My Native Land. In contrast to this, we find a very realistic picture of India in the post independence poets. It is an India which closely corresponds to the real India outside the book and outside the room in which the poem happens to be written. The raw reality of India is clearly visible in the post independence poetry. There is absolutely no attempt to idealize, to romanticize, to push, to sweep unpleasant things under the carpet. One cannot invent in the void. Nizim Ezekiel once confessed to an interviewer. One cannot invent in the void. At least I can't. The post-independence poetry is deeply rooted into the soil of reality, into the soil of the reality of India after independence, India as a free nation. I would like to bring into conjunction two very important poems in Indian poetry in English. Coromandel Fishers of Sarojini Naidu and Hunger of Jayanta Mahapatra. Coromandel Fishers, which is in traditional verse, which makes use of the metered line, the regular rhyme scheme in the stanzaic pattern, paints a very rosy picture of the lives of fisher folk on the eastern coast of India, on the Coromandel coast of India. In contrast to this, in Hunger of Jayanta Mahapatra, we come across a fisherman who sells his daughter to a tourist. The difference between Coromandel fishers and Hunger neatly encapsulates the significant contrast between the pre-independence poetry and its post-independence counterpart. The pre-independence poetry generally adopts a serious tone. It seems largely incapable of the capacity to laugh. Humor, irony, satire are almost always absent from pre-independence Indian poetry in English. The post-independence poetry has more than its share of laughter. It does not take itself too seriously. It adopts a lighter approach. Humor, irony, satire are abundantly present in it. Perhaps this discussion has created the impression that pre-independence Indian poetry in English and post-independence Indian poetry in English have absolutely nothing in common with each other. I'm really sorry if such an impression has been created, because though the contrasts are indeed sharp, there is also a lot of common ground between the pre-independence poetry and the post-independence poetry. First of all, the pre-independence poetry as well as the post-independence poetry are bodies of work created by Indians. This one fact is sufficient to give both both a unity. In fact, the two bodies of verse join together to create a united whole. It is like the white of the egg and the yellow of the egg. The white of the egg and the yellow of the egg jointly create the egg. I would like to work out a comparison between the passionate awareness of H.L.V. Derozio, the first Indian poet in English, of his Indian identity, and the equally passionate awareness of R. Parthasarathi of his Indian identity. The times may have changed, but the identity remains the same. I would like to juxtapose the use of nostalgia to create poetry in Toru Dutt's The Casuarina Tree, and the use of nostalgia to create poetry in My Grandmother's House of Kamala Das. A parallel can be established between the use of pigeon by Joseph Furtado to create poetry and the use of Indian English by Nizam Ezekiel to create poetry. Indian poetry in English is a poetry which originates from the Indian subcontinent. Naturally and understandably, the Indian subcontinent influences the poetry. The Indian subcontinent and its people, its history, its mythology, its religions, its society, its beliefs, its natural life, and this influence can be found in both the pre-independence poetry and its post-independence counterpart. To top it off, Indian poetry in English is a poetry written in the English language. Again, it is natural and understandable that British poetry and American poetry should influence it. This influence is felt equally in the pre-independence poetry and the post-independence poetry. The pre-independence poetry, which tries to follow the conventions and traditions of traditional British verse, and the post-independence poetry, which is hugely influenced by the free verse revolution unleashed by T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound.